so one of the jobs I had working for my master's degree was as a research assistant, and I had a stack of photographs on one side, and I was studying, and those were photographs of the Aleppo Codex, 1-to-1, and the other side was a printed Bible, and I had to check every jot and tittle to make sure what was in the Codex, the handwritten Bible from the year 924 AD. It's considered the most accurate copy of the Bible in existence, and it was copied by the master scribe Aaron ben Asher. And in the 12th century, Maimonides mentions this particular manuscript, this exact codex, and he describes how people would come from the entire Jewish world to check their Bibles. If you wrote a Bible in Yemen, or if you wrote a Bible in Spain and you wanted to make sure it was accurate, you got on a boat and you went to Jerusalem and later to Egypt, and you checked your Bible against the Aleppo Codex. Later it was in Aleppo. Originally it was called the Ben Asher Codex. And so even in ancient times, this was known to be the most accurate copy of the Bible in existence. And I had the privilege, and certainly I think at the time, the people around me didn't see it as a privilege. It was grunt work. I'm sitting there checking every dot and every dash, and it requires a certain amount of expertise, but beyond that, it's kind of very technical work.
And you weren't the first in line. I mean, you followed other editors who went before you checking their work.
I was like the third reader. So I would sometimes sit there for 8 hours checking every dot, not just that the dot was there, but then it was in the right place relative to the manuscript in the printed edition. And sometimes I'd sit there for 8 hours and not find a mistake. Like, you go bonkers looking at this sea of dots and dashes and scribbles, swiggles, like, there's 4 sets of symbols on every page. And it's such a complex system that Microsoft tried to create a font in which they put every symbol in its exact place, which they had done for Chinese and for Japanese, and they determined in the end that Biblical Hebrew is too complex.
And that's with 20,000 words in the Chinese language, and Biblical Hebrew is too complex.
Well, Biblical Hebrew is 22 characters, and then it has, depending how you count them, let's say about 13 or 14 vowel symbols, and then you have a couple dozen accents. So the math is, you do like 24 times 24 times 22. So you get to some huge number that they said, look, we're a base, I don't know what the math is, but it goes to like 64,000 or something. They're like, there's too many characters here. So we can't, there's too many combinations of characters. It has to be done by hand. It can't be done programmatically. So that was my job, to make sure everything had to be done by hand. There's no other way to do it. Make sure it was all in place. And
now, this is going to lead to one of the most amazing discoveries in this generation. But we're not going to go there yet. The Dead Sea Scrolls, another monumental project that you were involved with.
Yeah, there I was at Hebrew University, again, working on my master's degree. And this research position opened up where they said, we need someone to do some proofreading and some other things on the dead. It started out as just proofreading, and later it was like, well, we've got this text no one translated. Here we got a guy who's a good proofreader. Let's see if he can translate it. I'm like, yeah, sure. It's just Biblical Hebrew. It's not that difficult. So I end up working on the Dead Sea Scrolls, translating a few scrolls, you can find them in the Dead Sea Scrolls Reader. And, for me, this was, I would sometimes pinch myself and say, so am I really being paid to come in and do this? Like, this can't be real, because this is my dream from when I'm a child and being told you don't know enough. Well, what don't I know? Okay, I don't know about the Dead Sea Scrolls. I don't know about the Masoretic text, the Aleppo Codex. I wonder if I can learn about that one. I wonder if one day I could see what that is. And I get to do it. I get to be one of the people who's working on these things. Yeah. It's unbelievable. It was such a blessing. It really was.
The scriptures, one of the principles I want to lay down for everyone is something that Paul wrote. He said that the oracles of God were committed to the Jews. The word oracle sounds a little bit mystical, but it's literally logion. It's the word, it's the communication. The communication of God was committed to the Jews. And I say that they have done a far, far better job of preserving the oracles, the communication of the Almighty, because number one, Israel was chosen at Mount Sinai to be his chosen people. If you'll keep my commandments, you'll be my priest. A nation of priests, you'll be my prophets, my representatives to the entire world. It was David who said that the Almighty divided the nations according to the number of the sons of Israel. Yet at the Tower of Babel, it was going to be hundreds of years before Israel and his sons would be born. But the Almighty had a plan when he divided Nimrod's one world government up and distributed this pagan sun worship all over the earth. He chose a people that would go out and would change the world, and he gave them the choice spot in the middle of the planet, basically, with all the trade routes of the world going through it so that they would affect the entire world. In fact, the Sodomites of Sodom, Gomorrah, Admah, Zeboim, these Canaanite who came in and settled the land, that was what was being spread out throughout the world. And the Almighty interrupted that and brought his people in so that they would be the ones who would affect the world. And I see so much out there of people that, especially Western Gentiles in the Christian world, who come up with this concept that if the Jews do it, it's got to be wrong. No, that is pure idiocy. You know, there are things that are wrong, and Nehemia has been raised in the rabbinic world, but came out of it to be one of the foremost experts and has worked on things that none of these Gentile Christians would ever be paid. It doesn't matter what school you went to, what you thought you learned Hebrew. We're going to deal with things, ladies and gentlemen, that are revelation from heaven that have been set up for generations to come to pass. And now, with that background, I just sort of wanted to say that about this, because this is you're dealing with Hebrew on a level that American Christians can't even begin to approach.
Well, I want to give you an example. So you know, one of the things I dealt with, and what I really felt honored when I worked on the, you know, especially on the Aleppo Codex, was I was following, and I didn't even fully appreciate it at the time, I was following a long line of Jewish scribes whose job it was to focus on details. And you know, and to the point where it's like, who cares? Why do we need that level of precision? But later on, you find out that level of precision brings revelation. You know, when you're in the middle of it, you don't necessarily see it. But the outcome of that is then people can go to the biblical text and trust it. And know I'm reading exactly what the ancestors received at Mount Sinai and received from the prophets. And I want to give you an example. So the Hebrew word for scribe, Michael, is the word sofer. And the word sefer is book. And the one who writes a book, a scribe, is a sofer, but it comes from the word lispor, which is to count. And the idea was that when the scribes would finish a section of copying a text, they would count every dot and dash and jot and tittle, and they would compare it with the original and make sure that they didn't miss anything, right? And if they found out, wait, the original had 3,221 letters, and now I've got 3,220, I added a letter. 322. Well, I must check now every letter. And they would literally do that to the point where you find precision, which is mind-boggling. I want to give you an example of these Jewish scribes, and this will come in, you know, later when we look at some of these things. You'll understand why this is so important. But so, for example, Exodus 28:17, we have this passage, and you know, you read this in English and you burn right past it. It says, "And thou shalt set in its," this is talking about the breastplate of judgment. "And thou shalt set in its setting of stones, even 4 rows of stone. The first row shall be sardius, a topaz, a carbuncle. This shall be the first row," whatever. I don't even know what I just read, right? It's a bunch of stones. And in Hebrew, the word for carbuncle, and I don't even know what a carbuncle is in English, to be honest with you. It's some kind of gem, right? But the Hebrew word is bareket. Okay, interesting. That word appears later, and it's a very rare word. It appears 3 times in the Bible, twice in Exodus, both talking as bareket about the breastplate. Same exact word appears in Ezekiel 28:13, and it's describing this figure, the cherub in Eden. Some people say is Satan. Ezekiel 28:13, and there it also has, you know, he says the sardius, the topaz, and the diamond, the beryl, the onyx, the jasper, the sapphire, the emerald, and the carbuncle. And again, in Hebrew, it's the same 4 letters, bet, resh, kuf, tav, but this time, the vowels in the Hebrew manuscripts are not bareket, but barkat. And this is unbelievable. What it shows is that the Jewish scribes who preserved the oracles of God, as you said, logion, the words of God, they preserved a difference in the way a single word was pronounced from the time of Exodus and the time of Ezekiel. Meaning in the time of Moses, they called that bareket. In the time of Ezekiel, the same stone, they called it barkat. Now, you wouldn't know that just from the consonants. From the consonants, you'd say, oh, it's the same 4 letters. How is that pronounced? Well, the name of that stone is Barkat or Bereket, right? But not only did they preserve the letters, they even pronounced the pronunciation of the words down to this fine distinction of the dialect of Hebrew spoken in Moses' time versus Ezekiel's time. And just like to give you an example in English, it's not a great example, but we were talking the other day about those little critters that they're in this, they eat here in the American South. I don't eat them because they're not biblically clean. But some people call them crayfish and other people call them crawfish, right? Now imagine if those 2 words were written the same way but pronounced in different ways. And so these scribes were that meticulous that the same word with the same meaning was pronounced different ways in different periods of history, and they preserved that distinction in the Bible. I mean, that's the level of precision we're dealing with. And then I sit down and my job is to check every jot and tittle, and I realize, wow, we can't mess around here. Every letter, every dot, every dash, preserves sacred information from the prophets, the words of God, the logion. And this is what the Jews were entrusted with. And we have this ancient tradition of every word has to be taken exact and preserved. Now here's where things get a little complicated. When you translate it, well, then it's a free-for-all. And you can even see that in Jewish translations. You'll have what we call the Targum, and you'll have 2 different copies of the Targum, which is the ancient Aramaic translation of the Torah, and they could be completely different. Because it doesn't matter. A translation's an interpretation. It doesn't have to be precise. But the original text, every letter and dot and dash has to be preserved perfectly.
And so when Yeshua says, not one jot, one tittle from the Torah will pass until all is fulfilled,
right?
This is very significant because, we don't have these dots, these dashes. We don't have these diacritical markings in the English. We miss all these things, but they're still there.
Isn't that amazing that he was talking about that in the first century? And he says jots and tittles, the word for tittle is kuriah, which is a Greek word for a diacritical mark, a little dot that can change the pronunciation or meaning, which is exactly what the Hebrew vowels are. It's amazing.